The next part of this chapter deals with trait theories and the biological perspective. Now, a trait theorist would want to describe the basic classes of behavior that might define personality. So they want to figure out how to measure individual differences in personality traits and try and use those measures to understand and then predict how a person might behave. There are two major ways that people have gone about proposing these traits. The first of which is that you just propose a trait, something like dominance or friendliness or self-esteem, on the basis of either intuition or some existing theory of personality. So you basically decide that this is a trait that makes sense based on the existing research and based on how people act, so let's investigate this particular trait. The other way is actually a way that we've talked about previously when we were talking about intelligence, and this is factor analysis. And factor analysis is a statistical means of allowing researchers to reduce lots and lots of behaviors or lots and lots of measures to a smaller number of basic dimensions called factors. So a single factor would consist of behaviors that highly correlate with one another, and therefore we can assume that they have some kind of common psychological meaning. So if these behaviors are highly correlated, maybe they're both due to the same trait that underlines those kinds of behaviors. So using factor analysis on lots of behaviors related to personality, we can reduce those behaviors down to simple dimensions or traits that would reflect a continuum of behavior. So some theories would look at something like the continuum between introversion and extraversion. Whether you are introverted, so you are solitary, you enjoy being alone, tend to be reserved, don't like going out, or are you more extroverted, where you're outgoing and talkative, enjoy being out with people and interacting with friends? And this is again, a continuum where you're not either introverted or extroverted. You can fall somewhere in between. Maybe you're right in the middle, where sometimes you're introverted in nature and sometimes extroverted. Maybe you're an extreme extrovert and never an introvert. Or maybe you're a little bit biased one way or the other. You can fall anywhere on that continuum in this particular case. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are lots of different models that have used this method to try and boil human personality down into the correct number of personality factors or traits. So we're going to start by talking about Cattell's 16 personality factors, which, as you might imagine, say that humans or human personality can be boiled down into 6 individual traits or factors. And so we can look at this graph here where we have the 16 different factors, and they're listed again as a continuum. So reserved or outgoing. So that's more of a introverted versus extroverted. And in the graph here, they're ranging people who self-identify as athletes versus artists and where they tend to score on this continuum. So this would be average scores for groups of people. But it gives you an idea of how people might score based on these different things. So intelligence, less or more intelligent, emotionally stable or unstable, submissive, dominant, so on and so forth. So they have these 16 different factors that they believe are sufficient to fully encompass all of the complexities of human personality. At the other end of the trait theorist spectrum, we have individuals like Eysenck, again, I'm not great at pronouncing names here, who proposed only 2 dimensions. So as opposed to the 16 dimensions for Cattell here, Eysenck proposed only 2 dimensions needed to evaluate personality. So they looked at the spectrum of introversion to extroversion, and the spectrum from stability to instability. Though I will note that later in time, Eysenck ended up adding a third dimension, but still, 2 or 3 is significantly fewer than the 16 from the previous model. But if we hop to this image here, which shows this spectrum between introverted to extroverted and unstable to stable, we can see how different aspects fall in this two-dimensional model. So to interpret this diagram here, we have basically two different axes. So on the vertical axis here, we have low stability to high stability. And intersecting at a 90-degree angle, we have introversion and extroversion. And this would tell us that if you understand where someone scores on stability versus instability, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about their introversion versus extroversion. So those two ideas are independent. These two continuums or spectrums are independent of one another. So you'd need to be given a measure of both to figure out where a person falls in terms of personality. So we could look at someone who is moody. So they are highly unstable, but not too extreme in terms of introversion or extroversion. Or maybe someone who's calm is, again, closer to stability here. And so all of these different subcategories are going to be secondary traits that are combinations of the two primary dimensions that we have. And so even though only having two major dimensions seems like it would be fairly limiting, having these secondary traits shows us that there can be a wide range of different personality types covered by this particular theory. But these are the two extremes. As I said, the 16 traits versus 2 or 3 traits, that's the extremes of what people view personality as. And if you know anything about personality, and we might have talked about it a couple of times by now, you know that one of the most common models that's used for personality is the 5-factor model, or the big 5 of personality. And so this model came about because some people figured that Cattell's 16 dimensions was too many, and Eysenck's 2 or 3 was too few. And so they figured that the 5 universally found continuums that tend to pop up over and over again in multiple studies would be sufficient to fully describe human personality. And so our 5 factors for this model are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Extraversion and neuroticism actually end up overlapping fairly well with Eysenck's model with 2 factors. So introversion, extroversion, and there we go. Stability and instability, where neuroticism would be unstable. There's a pretty good overlap there. And with these 5 different factors, with these 5 different continuums in which people can score for their personality, we end up with a fairly infinite number of combinations to capture the diversity of human personality. So how do we evaluate which of these models is the best? How do we evaluate their effectiveness? Well, we can look at how good they are at predicting behavior. So if we can evaluate someone in terms of these models, how accurate are they in terms of matching with behavior that we observe? And as you might expect, our smaller, more concise models, the 5-factor and the 2-factor model, are quite good at predicting their behavior across a broad range. So they're a lot better at getting us the big picture of what people might do in a particular situation. And again, as we might expect, the 16-factor model ends up being better at predicting specific behavior. So because it has more of a fine resolution with more factors, it gives us a better prediction of specific behavior. So I guess it turns out that the better model, depends on what it is you're looking for. If you're looking for a broad interpretation of behavior, then either the 5 or 2-factor models would be sufficient. But if you want a more specific prediction, then the 16-factor model is the best way to go. So all of that has been focusing on the trait side of things. But what about the fact that this section is going to deal with the biological perspective? We can start considering the biological foundations that underlie personality. So again, if you think back to Psych 104, you might recall that nature and nurture, our genes and our environment, both influence the development of our personality traits. And the comparative contributions can differ depending on which particular trait we're looking at. So if you think back when we had talked about the 5-factor model, in terms of genes and environmental influences, things like neuroticism are a lot more genetically determined than the other 4 factors, the other 4 spectrums that we consider in that 5-factor model. So for different traits, we have different contributions from the environment and different contributions from your genetics. And if we want to consider that biological role in the development of these different traits, we can focus on 3 different levels. We can look at the level of the nervous system, of our genetics, and of evolution. So for example, in our nervous system, do we see different levels of neurotransmitters in different people that might be influencing their behavior? For genetics, do people have different genes? Possibly genes that influence neurotransmitters, or possibly genes that predispose us to certain types of behavior. Or you could look at evolution and the effect of natural selection on how these different genes and these different functions have come into being. So there's lots of different levels that you can evaluate the biological side of personality. So if we want to look at some evidence for this biological perspective, for some biological underpinning of personality, we have some evidence in multiple different areas. So people looking at that introversion-extroversion continuum, we see that the brains of extreme introverts tend to show lots and lots of activity. So they are over-aroused, their brains are overactive. And so that introversion, or those traits associated with introversion, like avoiding being out and about, might be means of minimizing stimulation. So that behavior is trying to minimize the amount of stimulation to an already stimulated brain. In contrast, the brains of extreme extroverts are under-aroused. So their extroverted behavior might be a way of seeking to get more stimulation for an understimulated brain. For the stability-instability continuum, we can actually see differences in how the autonomic nervous system responds. People who are stable, who are high on the stability side of the spectrum, have very gradual changes in autonomic nervous system arousal. So they take longer to switch on. For people who are high on the instability side of the spectrum, their autonomic nervous system acts very quickly. It's a fast shift from off to on, hence that instability. We've also started seeing links of specific neurotransmitters to specific kinds of behaviors. So for example, dopamine is linked to both extraversion and openness. And we also see a link with both dopamine and serotonin to things like impulsivity. So there seem to be associations between these different biological levels and specific behaviors that relate to our personality. So we have some pretty good support here that there is at least some kind of biological factor influencing our personality. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, we started talking about personality traits and the fact that our personality tends to be relatively stable. Now, we didn't say entirely stable, because in terms of our traits and our behaviors, we see evidence for both stability and change depending on the situation and the setup. So, for the most part, some of our traits, things like our introversion-extraversion spectrum, our levels of emotionality, and our activity levels, how energetic we are, those tend to remain stable over time. So they tend to be pretty consistent, at least once we've hit adulthood. There's lots of changes that happen as we mature from childhood to adulthood, but once we hit adulthood, they tend to be pretty stable over time. We even see a certain amount of stability in thought patterns, at least some thought patterns. So, for example, people who are optimistic tend to stay optimistic over time. Again, there's the caveat that there can be major life events that change that. An optimistic person who faces a lot of hardship can become pessimistic, but for the most part, in the absence of major life-changing events, those thought patterns tend to remain pretty stable. When we start talking about behavior, that's when things start going off the rails a little bit. Because behavior is the result of an interaction, a person's response to a particular stimulus in the environment, behavior is going to be less stable over time. So there's more factors going on here, there are more things at play, so behavior tends to be less stable over time than something like a trait. So even if we can use all of these theories and tests to try and determine someone's personality traits, we can run into some difficulty trying to predict their behavior, to predict how they will react in a certain situation based solely on those personality traits. And this difficulty comes from three different factors. The first is that no trait stands alone. Our traits interact with other traits. So you are not just an introvert or an extrovert, you are also however many other factors we're considering at the time. So there are other factors that could be influencing your behavior. It's a lot more complicated than just the one trait you might be looking at. We also run into issues based on the importance that a person gives to an individual trait. So if somebody highly values their self-identification as an introvert, maybe that is the most important part of their personality to them, then that trait might take precedence or might be stronger than any other trait that they might have used instead. So the importance of that trait can influence how consistently they act in accordance to that trait. The textbook uses the example of honesty. And so if you are someone who scores high in honesty and you highly value honesty, then you might speak honestly in a situation, even if it goes against other aspects of your personality, just because you place such high importance on being honest. The third factor here is our variation in something called self-monitoring. And this is our tendency to regulate our social behavior in accordance with situational cues versus our internal values or attitudes or needs. So to help explain what that means, if we consider someone who scores high in the trait of being a self-monitor, they're going to be highly attentive to situational cues. So they would adapt their behavior based on what they think would be most appropriate in this particular situation. So rather than basing their behavior on their personality or how they would want to act, they base their behavior on what is appropriate for the situation that they're in right now. So they might ignore aspects of their personality to behave in a way that matches their given situation at that time. In contrast, people who are low in this idea of self-monitoring, they're going to pay little attention to the situation that they're in and they're going to attend instead to their internal beliefs. So they're going to act the way that they want to act, no matter what the situation is, because their internal beliefs and values are more important than acting appropriate to the situation. And if we have people who are very extreme or very high in terms of self-monitoring, we can start seeing dramatic swings in their behavior that really have nothing to do with their personality as a whole. It just has to do with how attentive they are to the social situation that they're in, which makes it very difficult to get a feel for their personality and their behavior based on that personality, because it's being overridden by another factor. And so to wrap up, we can start thinking critically about this trait approach. So what's good about the trait approach? Well, it focuses our attention on the value of identifying and measuring these different personality dispositions. Lots of researchers have done lots of research to try and get at the specific traits that seem to differ between people with differing personalities. They've done a very thorough job in evaluating human personality, and they've looked at personality in lots of different populations around the world. So they've done a fairly thorough job in this evaluation. In terms of downsides, there are quite a few that we can point out. So the first that we want to consider is the fact that this is simply a description of the structure of personality and individual differences. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the underlying psychological mechanisms. It doesn't tell us what's going on to create these personality differences. It doesn't really help us understand why they are the way they are. It just helps us describe what they are. We also have to keep in mind that this description is so much a causal relationship, where we're not saying that extroverted people do this thing. We can just point to there being a relationship between certain behaviors and scoring high on the scale of extroversion. So there are limitations to how we can employ or apply the findings of different trait approaches. And as we've already pointed out, there are some limitations in terms of predicting behavior because of, well, these difficulties here, where it's a lot more complicated than looking at any one trait on its own. There's lots of interactions. People are more complicated than just the model. We don't assign equal value to each of the traits. And there are other factors that can override our personality. So there's a lot more to consider than just looking at the traits that affect our personality or that make up our personality.